Hey everybody, Miss Ford here. Today I am going to show you how to make a bread called ciabatta bread. It's also known as slipper bread. And to do this, first you have to start with something called a biga, and that's a pre-ferment. Okay, so all that I need for the biga is flour, yeast, and water. So I'm going to measure into my mixer bowl. I need 319 grams of flour. I'm using my kitchen scale. If you don't have a kitchen scale, it's definitely worth investing in. So 319 grams. Mine goes by 5, so I'm going to try to get 320. I went over a little bit, take some out. Perfect. And then I need 1.5 grams of yeast. I'm doing the active dry yeast. So let's see, 1.5 grams. So 1.5 grams of yeast is kind of hard to measure, but it's about a half of a teaspoon, give or take. So go with that. And now I'm going to add 213 grams of water that's about room temperature. So I have my scale on, 213. Now, all breads that require biga might require a wetter biga or a drier biga, but this one, these measurements should be perfect. So I'm just going to mix this with the flat paddle attachment, not the dough hook, but the flat paddle attachment for 1 minute until it comes together and it'll form kind of a ball. Okay, it's been about a minute, so I'm going to remove the paddle attachment and I'm going to put the dough hook on and I'm going to knead it for about 3 to 4 minutes. You can do this by hand on your counter as well. Okay, so I've been letting the biga knead with my dough hook for the last 3 minutes. I have a bowl and I'm going to put a little bit of oil in it. And I'm just going to, I have a paper towel, I'm just going to spread that oil around. Again, this is to help the dough rise so it doesn't stick to the bowl, so you get the max benefit of the rising out of it. I'm going to take my dough out. And I'm going to lightly stick it in my greased bowl. And I'm going to spread it around to get that oil all over it. And I'm going to cover this and I'm going to let this rise at room temperature for about 2 hours. I want it to get about 1.5 times its size. So 2 hours on the counter, covered with a tea towel or a loosely placed piece of plastic wrap. And then I'm going to deflate it after those 2 hours, roll it into a ball again, and then I'm going to stick it in the fridge overnight. So I'll show you that in 2 hours. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet because I just put the kids to bed. But the dough has been rising for 2 hours, and it has 1.5 times doubled its size. So now I'm just going to turn it out onto my counter to degas it and form it into another ball and stick it back in the bowl. Okay, so the dough is beautiful. It's soft and light and fluffy. And I'm just going to take it out of my bowl. And I'm going to knead it just a couple times just to degas it. Get all those carbon dioxide bubbles out of my dough that the yeast has released. And now I'm going to put it back in my bowl and wrap it with saran wrap and stick it in the fridge. And I can leave it in the fridge for up to 3 days if need be, if I'm not quite ready to make my ciabatta. Or I can actually stick it in the freezer in an airtight Ziploc bag for up to 3 months and then pull it out when I need it. But I'm going to be finishing up the ciabatta probably tomorrow or the next day. So I'll show you how that is. So I decided to clean out my bowl before I stick my biga back in there because I didn't want the sticky remnants from the dough to prevent any of the rising that needs to happen. So I washed it out, or you can use a new bowl. I'm going to re-grease it. before I add my deflated biga back in there. And again, I'm going to give it a little toss to make sure it's coated with the vegetable oil. And then just a layer of plastic wrap, saran wrap, and in the fridge for at least 24 hours, if not 3 days. Okay, so it has been about 2 days and my biga has been sitting in the fridge. I pulled it out about an hour ago to help it get to room temperature. You can see this beautiful bubble here from the carbon dioxide that the yeast has produced. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sponge method. So there's different methods of making yeast bread, and this particular method is called the sponge method, and it's because we've made this pre-ferment beforehand. So this biga is a pre-ferment. It's a sponge, and we made it prior to, and we let it sit for a few days to gain a depth of flavor. It'll make the bread a little bit lighter and fluffier. And then once you've made a sponge or a pre-ferment, you add it later to the actual dough ingredients, and that's the sponge method. So what we need today is we need 454 grams of our biga. We need about 255 grams of bread flour, but again, I don't have bread flour, so I'm going to be using all-purpose flour. Again, the difference is the amount of protein in the flours. Bread flour has a higher protein content, so it gives it a little chewier taste, which is ideal, but you can't find it anywhere, so we're going to do all-purpose. And next you need 10.5 grams of salt, 5 grams of yeast, 227 grams of warm water, ideally around 110 degrees, and 28 grams of olive oil. So I've added my flour, my salt, and my yeast into my mixing bowl now. I'm going to be working on my wooden cutting board for now. I'm just going to drizzle a little bit of oil on it just to try to help so that my dough doesn't stick on it. Just kind of spread it around. And I'm going to scrape out my biga because I think I have a little too much than what's called for in the actual recipe. Now this is a really wet sponge, and so it will be kind of sticky. That's why I put the olive oil, because the oil makes it so that it does not stick. So I'm going to cut this into small bits. So I need 454 grams. So I am going to take my bowl back, and I'm going to actually weigh that out. The reason I'm cutting it into small bits is because it will help it mix in well with the rest of the ingredients when I add it. Ooh, it might just be perfect. I have a tiny bit left over. You can throw that into a loaf of sourdough you're making or any other bread you're going to be making. Just add that to it. It'll add a little bit more depth of flavor. So I have my paddle attachment again, and I am going to be mixing this as I add my biga on low speed. And then I'm going to gradually pour in my warm water and my olive oil. And I'm going to let that mix until it forms a nice wet dough. Eventually your dough will come together to somewhat of a very soggy type looking ball. And you'd rather your dough be too wet than too dry, especially with ciabatta, because it's what's going to give it those uneven, beautiful bubbles in the crumb. Okay, so I probably was kneading it with my paddle attachment for about 5 minutes, and then it started to come together. So that's a good amount of time. Ciabatta is also known as slipper bread because it tends to look kind of flat and elongated like a slipper. So, okay, I'm going to take some flour and sprinkle some flour on my work surface. And I'm going to scoop out my beautiful dough. And at this point, I am just going to lightly cover it with some saran wrap, and I'm going to let it rest on my counter for about an hour. Okay, I just remembered, don't make this mistake, to add a little bit of oil to the top of your bread. You can just drizzle it. Otherwise your saran wrap or your plastic wrap will stick to it, and you don't want that. So just a thin smear of oil. And there you go. Okay, so my ciabatta dough has been resting and fermenting for about an hour. So I just peel the paper off. You might want to put some flour or oil on your hands to prevent it from sticking to your hands, because it is a very, very wet dough. I'm going to pull it on top of each other itself. Kind of punch it down a little bit. And then I'm just going to let that sit for 1 more hour. Okay, so I have allowed this to rest on the counter for another hour, and as you can tell, it's really happy now. So I'm going to be doing something called the stretch and fold method, and I'm going to be doing this about every 15 minutes for the next hour. So I'll have a total of 4 stretch and folds. So I'm just going to, get a little bit of olive oil on my hands so that it doesn't stick, because it's still really wet, and I'm just going to kind of punch it down a little bit, and I'm going to stretch and fold it over, and stretch and fold it over. And then I'm going to let this sit and rest for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to do that again. Okay, so my dough has really solidified. If your dough is still really sticky, you can keep doing this folding method every 15 minutes until it kind of really comes together and isn't super sticky anymore. At this point, I am going to cut it into 6 mini loaves, and I'm going to get my oven preheated to 450 degrees. So I'm just going to cut it right down the center. These are great for sandwiches. You can use them for hamburger buns. I'm just going to leave them on the counter for just probably until my oven is preheated, because these are looking really beautiful right now. And then right now I have my pizza stone in the oven. I wish I had a brick oven. I don't. So I have a pizza stone. So I'm going to put them on the pizza stone. Okay, so my oven is at 450 and my bread is all ready to go. So I have my pizza oven in there, and I'm going to gently put these on top of the pizza oven. And then before I close the oven doors, I'm going to take some water. If I had a squirt gun, I would do that. And I'm just going to squirt some in the bottom and close it up. Like I said, that steam will help keep the crust nice and soft, so that it gives it a little bit more time to have that oven spring that last rise. So it's been about a half an hour. I've been sprinkling water in the bottom of the oven every 10 minutes. And I just pulled them out because they are done. They are super crispy on the outside. And I'm going to cut into one of them and show you what the inside looks like. Okay, so obviously you can make that all into one large loaf, but I made it into 6 smaller loaves because I'm going to be using it as sandwiches or hot dogs or hamburgers. You can see all of the beautiful bubbles in the crumb of this bread, and it is so soft on the inside and nice and crunchy and crispy on the outside. My favorite way to do it is to spread a little bit of butter on that and then put it in the frying pan and let it toast up with that yummy, get the butter nice and browned, and Ian, hold it still, and you have a beautiful sandwich.
I'm going to show you the whole thing.